Well, you're a peasant, and the cosmos has established that you're a peasant, and I'm an aristocrat, and so screw you. And actually, morally speaking, because if you weren't a useless slug, you wouldn't be a peasant.
Hi, welcome to Coffee and the Word. My name's Paul, and I'm a local church pastor here in South Wales. And today we're looking at a conversation between Jordan Peterson and John Lennox. Now, I love Jordan Peterson, and he's read his book, 12 Rules for Life, and even 12 More Rules for Life, read that one too. And he's a great guy. But one of my issues with Jordan Peterson is whenever he's been asked whether or not he's a Christian or whether he believes in God, usually is the question he's asked, he says, I act as if God exists. And so he's never really been pressed a whole lot from what I've seen on his Christian faith. That is until maybe this video right here. And in this video, I won't say that John Lennox presses him in a great way, but I think I see John Lennox in this video take Jordan Peterson further regarding Jordan Peterson's view on God and Christ than maybe others by bringing in both the gospel and the resurrection in very clever ways. And I think it's going to be really interesting as we go through this video to see how Jordan Peterson reacts to John Lennox. Now, if you don't know John Lennox, he's a professor at Cambridge, professor of mathematics. And normally, if you told me you want to watch a conversation with a mathematician, I'd be like, no, thanks, not interested. But John Lennox is a fantastic guy, great communicator, amazing mind. He also has a brilliant accent, being from Northern Ireland as well. And so you'll probably find this conversation hopefully riveting, stimulating, as I've kind of taken out some of the best bits where maybe faith is talked about more than some of the scientific stuff that they talk about in other parts of the video. So with all that being said, we're going to jump into two clips now back to back. And we're just going to see John Lennox actually begin what I would say is a funnel of evangelism, especially with somebody like Jordan Peterson, rather than diving straight to, hey, so do you believe Jesus rose again, or the resurrection, or do you want to repent and put your trust in Jesus? He actually starts with taking Jordan Peterson back to the idea of the creator. Now, we know that Jordan Peterson believes in a creator, but we're going to see as John Lennox goes through this, how he's going to kind of funnel things down to the core evangelistic points and messages of Christianity.
And all of that leads me to formulate it as follows, that we live in a word-based universe. And that's the key of the Logos for me.
Okay, and so what do you mean in that case? So what do you mean specifically that we live in a word-based universe? What does that mean for you on the broader conceptual landscape?
Well, it means that this universe is not simply a product of natural unguided forces. It is a product of a rational creator, an intelligent creator, and I believe even more than that, a personal creator. Now, how I get there is only in part from a response to the universe as I find it, the point you made about each organism being a microcosm of its environment. It's also, it seems to me that there are two major sources of knowledge. There is, first of all, observing the universe, science, etc. Then there are the humanities. But there's also the concept of revelation, in which I believe. In other words, it's not simply the human quest for the creator. It's the creator revealing himself. So for me, the anchor point in the end is that the Logos became human, and we beheld his glory. In other words, we can see exactly what this means in terms of what we can understand. That is the human being in which God encoded himself in Christ. When I did the debate with Dawkins at the Oxford Natural History Museum, at the press conference afterwards, we were asked, was there anything that we agreed on? And there was one thing, and that is that truth exists. And this is a crucial thing. It depends that we are committed to the pursuit of truth. Otherwise, as you say, science is absolutely no point. I happen to believe that truth, of course, is not simply propositional truth, but ultimately truth is a person. And that is the very deep claim. I am the way, the truth, and the life. And it's interesting there that Jesus wasn't merely saying, I say true things. This goes much deeper. I am the truth. And if we set up a sequence of questions about anything, what is the truth about the atom? Well, you can split it into elementary particles. What is the truth about those? I believe this claim is so big that it's actually saying that at the end of the backward sequence of questions, Jesus Christ will say, I am the truth.
So the video that this originally is from, I think it's entitled something like The Deepest Conversation You'll Ever Hear. And trust me, this is only the beginning. It's going to get deep. But I love how John Lennox brings in a couple of ideas here. And this is really good for somebody that has all sorts of evangelistic conversations like myself, to kind of see his mind at work, but also kind of his heart is coming through as somebody that's alive for Jesus, loves the Lord Jesus, starting with not just the idea of a creator, but a personal creator. And so he's already distinguishing himself from a deist. Somebody says, yeah, I believe there's a God. I believe that somebody's set the universe in motion, sort of wound up the clock, so to speak, and just let it kind of tick along, and people do whatever they want to do, need to do. He's not doing that. He's saying this is a personal creator. And this is a creator. Do you notice how he picked up that he said, encoded himself in a person, and the person of Jesus Christ. And so he brings the person of Jesus Christ to the fore. And this is key for Jordan Peterson, because my concern about Jordan Peterson is he hasn't been faced with the question of who is Christ and who is Christ to you. So John Lennox isn't going to be so in your face with this, although I'd love to see somebody like a John MacArthur on there. I know some of you are watching my channel and say, Paul, are you really saying John MacArthur? Yeah, I'm saying John MacArthur. I disagree with him on the gifts, but regarding him in evangelistic conversations and his boldness, I think he's brilliant, and I think he does kind of press people on the issue. And so I would love to see a guy like that in conversation with him as well. Maybe kind of pushing more, like, what do you think? Why do you believe? What don't you believe? But Jordan Peterson has always been kind of ambiguous, and I don't know, and just kind of like, I've almost got to be able to reason it out and think it through. And of course, John Lennox is already in many ways beginning to counter that part of Jordan Peterson by bringing in these two aspects of truth, where he's talking about revelation and objective truth. And of course, Jordan Peterson, he understands objective truth. This is a guy that quotes countless studies in his discussions and his debates. But revelation is very different. Revelation is something that can only be granted to us by God himself. Remember when Jesus is with the disciples and he says, who do men say that I am? And some say you're a teacher, you're a prophet. And then he says, who do you say that I am? Peter says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And he says, God has revealed that to you. Revelation comes from God. And so there's another aspect of truth. And of course, God is revealing himself through creation, as Romans testifies, and in many other means, and ultimately through the person of Jesus Christ. And so we see John Lennox really kind of pushing towards that aspect of Jesus being revealed truth and ultimately actually being truth. So this is, for me, knowing Jordan Peterson, having read his books, this is a discussion that is going in a place that many others with him haven't. So now we're going to move into another part of the discussion where they begin to speak about death. And they're going to kind of deal with the ideas of death and bring that into the conversation as well. And it's been interesting to see how John Lennox tackles that, how he doesn't shy away from that, and his take on that as well.
What you're saying reminds me of Dostoevsky, who said that he couldn't imagine a great person who had not known some kind of suffering. And what we try to do with our children is somehow to limit that. But we realize that part of their maturing has to do with how they learn to handle life. And we don't want to leave them defenseless, do we? So what you're raising is a very big set of questions. Now, you mentioned that transhumanism attempts to solve some of this vulnerability. And of course, some things are very good. I wear glasses and they enhance my vision and they're very important. But this idea of Harari's, where he sets two agenda items for the 21st century, firstly, to abolish physical death, to solve it as a technical medical problem, and then to enhance human happiness by genetic engineering and cyborg engineering and so forth. I take a very radical view of that. When people hold out this promise to me, I simply say to them, you're too late. The problem of physical death was solved 20 centuries ago, because I think there's strong evidence that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. And the problem, therefore, of developing some kind of immortality was simultaneously sold to that, because Christ promises to those that trust him and follow him that he will eventually raise them from the dead, and that will be the best uploading you can ever imagine of brains, body, and everything else. So I take a very radical view that the transhumanist ideal is bound to fail, and there are deeper reasons behind that as well.
Well, so there's also a biological truism on the genetic front. And so, for example, and it's summed up in the phrase, there is no breeding for evolutionary fitness.
I love what John Lennox does there, how he kind of turns this conversation about transhumanism and into a conversation regarding death. And then you see how he brings in the resurrection. And this is the thing I've been screaming at kind of YouTube videos for ages, when you've had people talk to Jordan Peterson and ask him the question, do you believe in God? And I'm like, no, you're asking the wrong question. The question you want to ask is, do you believe Jesus Christ is the Son of God and he rose from the dead? And of course, John Lennox, rather than confronting him with that question, he's bringing around the resurrection and the person of Jesus in these kind of clever conversations with the things that Jordan Peterson is asking him and bringing up. And so in this particular part of the conversation, he's just essentially moved the conversation from transhumanism and this idea of maybe modifying our bodies through technology and other means so that eventually either we don't kind of decay or we don't die or we're able to replace things. And he's like, hey, that's been solved 2,000 years ago by Jesus Christ when he rose from the dead. And actually the promise that we have because he rose from the dead is that we also can rise from the dead. Now, I love this truth bomb has just been dropped on Jordan Peterson. And what is amazing in Jordan Peterson's response, and we're going to see this several more times before we finish this video, is Jordan Peterson seems to almost ignore the truth bomb that's just been set off in front of him, this kind of amazing nugget of wisdom regarding the Christian faith, and he's moved that sideways rather than kind of receive it, acknowledge it, speak into it a little bit. Even if he disagrees, he almost kind of shifts it aside as if he doesn't know what to do with what he's just received. And this is really interesting to me, but also kind of gives me a few concerns around Jordan Peterson. As much as I love him, that maybe he's kind of still hard or resistant to the gospel in some ways, maybe because of intellectual reasons or other reasons, but he's not quite there ready to receive it. Now, I will say this video this interview was done a good many months ago. So where Jordan Peterson is as of today, I don't know. I don't have any up-to-date information, but I think it's really interesting how he handles this conversation regarding some of the things that's kind of put his way. And now we're going to go into another couple of clips where they begin to discuss morality, power dynamics, and eventually what is the meaning of true sacrifice. And it's going to be really interesting to see how John Lennox again brings in the core aspects of the gospel from this conversation.
Well, you're a peasant, and the cosmos has established that you're a peasant, and I'm an aristocrat, and so screw you. And actually, morally speaking, because if you weren't a useless slug, you wouldn't be a peasant. And that's a very, very difficult argument to generate a counter proposition to. And the corollary argument is, well, if I can force you, clearly I'm more powerful than you are, and that means that I have every moral right to do so. And in fact, you don't even get to object because you're too lowly to object.
But that reflects,
and that's the way of the world, man.
Yeah, but it reflects a series of values that needs to be questioned. Where do these values come from? To argue that the cosmos made me an aristocrat and you a serf is a very tenuous argument. And in the end, it seems to me that we've got to ask ourselves the fundamental question: what basis have we for valuing human beings as unique? And again, I refer to your comment on Genesis. We're made in the image of God. That gives us huge dignity and value. It was something my parents got across to me when I was very young. And as a Christian, even at the bigger level, the idea that there's a higher value even than the created value, which is the whole topic of Exodus. And I was utterly fascinated by your conversation on Exodus, because the valuation of people that is reflected in the Passover lamb and the sacrifice, in that God accepts them on the basis of a sacrifice. And it seems to me that actually leads me, now that I think of it, into another direction. One of the problems of establishing rules of any kind seems to me that many of them bypass the heart of Exodus. It's very noticeable that the law of the commandments comes after the Passover sacrifice, after the redemption. And in the New Testament, the parallel thing for Christians is the sacrifice is first, the acceptance is settled. It's not on the basis of your moral behavior or life, but that empowers you to live, so that the moral commandments in the letters of Paul, for example, come after the discussion of the sacrifice that gives you a true value. Now, that is something that is lacking at the heart of our culture. We have no answer, ultimately, to the big questions of guilt and the whole problem. Nobody likes the word sin, but that's what it is, the moral damage we cause to ourselves and other people. And setting up rules and regulations is hugely important. We need them. They're in the New Testament and in the Old Testament. But I notice that one of the major messages of Exodus is first redemption. And redemption is by the blood of the Passover lamb, to put it in the biblical language, and then the teaching. And the same exactly in the New Testament.
So let's delve into that. What's the sacrifice that's most pleasing to God? And the answer to that has to be something like, well, yourself, right? You have to offer up everything to what's transcendent. And I think that is that sacrifice that you described, that's an a priori act before the coming of the law, right? It's the willingness to voluntarily lay everything on the line in the pursuit of truth and life more abundant, something like that. And I think that is the pattern that's laid out in the Christian story. It looks to me like that's the pattern.
Yeah, well, let me comment on that. I'm very interested that you mentioned Barbara McClintock, because actually she discovered the so-called jumping gene, and she really was the pioneer that's led to this third wave of biology I mentioned earlier. That's just a point aside, but it's extremely interesting. She was a pioneer, and she sacrificed a great deal. But it seems to me that we may need to think in terms of different kinds of sacrifice. You see, at the heart of Christianity is not my sacrifice, but God's sacrifice on my part, a sacrifice that I could not have made, but that sacrifice demands my sacrifice. Offer up your body as a living sacrifice is what Paul says to me as a Christian. But I'm prepared to do that. The power to do that comes from the fact that my acceptance with God depends on a sacrifice that's entirely outside of me, but can be appropriated by me. And that is when Christ died and rose again. Now, this goes very deep, but it goes to the heart of God doing something so that he can forgive me and deal with the guilt that I've incurred by my messed up behavior and all the rest of it. That's one thing. Now, in response to that, yes, of course, we're called upon to sacrifice. And there are all these different levels. A mother sacrifices for her child. She doesn't sacrifice to some God. She gives up her time and her energy, and sometimes slaves very hard working to make ends meet for the children. So she's given her all in that sense and at that level. But there's a much more fundamental level that deals with the problem of human relationship with God that's gone wrong ever since Genesis 3.
So you mentioned that the maternal sacrifice, and so there were archaic societies where people sacrificed their children.
I love what John Lennox does there in dropping another truth bomb on Jordan Peterson regarding the gospel, just kind of pivoting this whole conversation of morality around the conversation of redemption, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament, and how morality actually comes from being redeemed, being brought into the people of God, and how we actually live out our sacrifice to God from that place. Now, for somebody like Jordan Peterson, who talks about cleaning up your room and taking moral responsibility, all very good lessons, this is probably a hard thing for him to kind of get his head around, because his life, if I would be guessing right, and I don't know him personally, but I'm just kind of assuming from what I've seen, would be revolving around, I've got to live in such a way that God is true. That means my actions got to live in such a way that if he looks at my actions, he's going to judge me accordingly. And of course, God will judge him accordingly, but ultimately his actions will be judged against those of Jesus Christ, which is the standard of perfection. He can't meet that. And so it's amazing to see how this idea then of the sacrifice of Christ is brought in as a means by which then we live from that position rather than towards that position. And of course, what does Jordan Peterson do at the end of this clip? He picks up on a conversation around the sacrifice of a mother, brings that in, some kind of psychology. If you're sitting where I'm sitting, I'm like, oh, it sounds like psychobabble. I'm sure it's very intelligent and very meaningful, just over my head. And so he kind of goes from there. But John Lennox doesn't give up, and this is what I love about what he's doing here. He's taking every opportunity to pivot a conversation towards the gospel. He's going to do that again in these last couple of clips, and as he does that, he's going to take another run at the resurrection as well, and this will be kind of the final clip of the interview between the two. So we're going to show this clip, and I'll leave some final commentary, and we'll end the video from there.
So the Christian notion of resurrection is an extension of that corpus of ideas, because it's predicated on the notion that if you forthrightly confronted the whole panoply of the horrors of death in its multiple forms, death and betrayal and the catastrophe of the mob, if you faced all of that, what you would see as a consequence is not so much eternal darkness as the eternal resurrection of the light. And it's a limit case, right? And I really, it's hard for me to know what to make of that, again, on the psychological front, because it's a truism, definitely, both in the narrative domain and in the practical clinical domain, is that if people can find it within themselves to voluntarily shoulder the burden of confronting what they're afraid of, they definitely get braver and more competent. And some of that's because they get informed about themselves, but there are also even biological transformations that take place. If you voluntarily face a stressor, entirely different psychophysiological systems are manifest in you as a consequence of the voluntary confrontation that would be manifest if it was imposed on you involuntarily. It's a whole different spirit that inhabits you. That's a very good way of thinking about it. It's genuinely a different spirit that inhabits you, and it makes itself manifest all the way from the cellular level upward. And the habitual practice of that attitude of voluntary confrontation can switch on new genes. It doesn't just happen conceptually, it actually transforms you physiologically. And we have no idea what the limit of that is.
There's a very interesting, in fact, brilliant illustration of that principle in the New Testament, in the famous story of the man Lazarus and his two sisters. Jesus is with his disciples in Galilee, a long way from where they lived. And they send him a message and say that Lazarus, the one you love, is ill. He was a friend of Jesus. And Jesus doesn't do anything to come to them and allows the man to die. And in that situation, he says to his disciples, let's now go to them, and explains that Lazarus is actually dead. And they get really scared, and they say, are you going to go to Judea again? Look, they were seeking to kill you. Why do you go there again? It's like committing suicide. And Thomas, one of them, the doubter, he says, let's go with him that we might die with him. But when they go, what happens is that Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead, and that's the light that transforms everything. If they had stayed away and not gone with him into what was potential danger, they would have never learned that he could raise the dead, so they would have stayed in the darkness. And Jesus explains the thing in a very interesting metaphor. He talks about himself as the light of the world, and he says, God has made the solar system in a very interesting way, that he's placed the light that we see by during the day outside our world. The sun's outside our world. So if a person walks in the night, they will stumble because, and here's the observation, it's a very interesting one. Jesus says, because the light isn't in them. Now, the light is in some deep sea creatures, as we know. They've got luminescence and all the rest. And I often wish I had a built-in light in my head. And sometimes I wear one, a little lamp. But the point is, he's saying, look, the light isn't in you. I am the light of the world. He that follows me will have the light of life. And I just imagine it very simplistically, that if here's the light and here's me and the light moves, I'll end up in the dark. But if I move with the light, I will have the light all the time. And that's exactly what happened to these people, consumed with fear. They went with him thinking they'd be killed, and then they discovered he could raise the dead, and that transformed everything. So that seems to me to be a very powerful exposition of what you're saying.
Mm-hmm. Well, look, John, I think that's a good place to end, actually.
Here we go. What a brilliant way to end that conversation. Essentially following Jesus, following the light, that this walk, this life is about Christ, knowing him, following him. He's the light. If we're outside of him, we're in darkness. And I love that truth that John Lennox has left Jordan Peterson with. And of course, Jordan Peterson is the end of the interview. Now, I don't know how Jordan Peterson would have gone away from this conversation, digested these things, thought about these things, how maybe it's worked on his heart. But what I would say is that when we're looking at somebody like Jordan Peterson, who's obviously a very inspirational guy, incredibly intelligent, articulate, brings what I would say is good Bible-based morals to a lot of people today that maybe are not darkening the doors of our churches, but some who are hearing what he's saying, hear him talk about the scriptures and bring in the Bible as illustrations to a lot of the things that he's sharing, and have spurred them to come to church and look into Christianity further and then eventually find Christ. I think that's a good thing. My heart's desire is that Jordan Peterson himself would come to a saving faith in Jesus Christ if he hasn't already. I say if he hasn't already, because like I said, I don't know where he is as of today, as of recording this video, but to my knowledge, he doesn't seem to have yet affirmed that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, the resurrection, and put his trust in him. But I pray that he does so. But this conversation to me, and I'd encourage you to check out the whole video. A lot of it is quite what I would say technical in some aspects outside of the conversations around Christianity. But it'll make you smarter, it'll make you better. You'll learn a lot of great stuff about evangelism, even if you kind of take it from highbrow to lowbrow, which is probably how I'll be using it, in a sense of just how to pivot some of those conversations around the gospel, around the truth, and ultimately landing on the person of Jesus Christ and following him and our need for him. So hopefully this has encouraged you. If it has, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel. You can also now follow me on Twitter, because that's a thing that I'm doing, or X as it's known, and the link to that is on my channel and will be in the description as well. But in the meantime, God bless you, have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye now.